If you believe in the Judeo-Christian God, do you respect him? When you pray, do you use the pronouns thou, thee, thy, or thine? Or do you use you, your, or even ye? Whichever the case, why? And perhaps more importantly, which should you be using? Allow me to explain. When I used to go to church, I would ask people who used the thou, thee, thy form with God why they did so. And aside from just because, or the answer because that's what's in the Bible, the only real answer I would get was, well, because it's archaic and because it's in the Bible, it must therefore be more respectful. And I want to respect God because He's divine, He is our creator. And I accepted that answer. But it was completely wrong. Before I go any further, I need to explain something first. In sociolinguistics, there is a phenomenon that is called the tu-vos distinction. This distinction occurs in many Indo-European languages as well as other languages. What it is in Latin, the singular form for you was tu, and the plural form was vos. However, as time went on, eventually something happened. Societies around Europe, particularly, began to decide that the plural form would also be designated for singular people when talking to someone who is socially higher than you or to someone you wish to show your respect. For example, your boss, your teacher, your parents. But what about God? After I began to study foreign languages, I would also read scriptures in those languages, and what I found is that aside from Japanese, the reason for which will be in the description, every language where available uses the informal pronoun of you with God. Yes, even English. Thou was never the formal pronoun. It still is not the formal pronoun. Some people claim it to be, but that just isn't the case. There are indeed certain dialects where thou is still used, and it is used as the informal pronoun. And even though there are some religious people here and there, and even certain denominations which encourage using thou when praying, if that were the case, that thou is really the respectful pronoun, then you would hear those people also using it with their bosses or other places where the formal pronouns are used in other languages. But it's not. If anything, for those people, it is the God pronoun. And sorry to say this, but unlike the Middle Ages, a few denominations of certain religions do not have much bearing on the English language as a whole. You can maybe argue that for some people it is the formal pronoun or the God pronoun, but that's not really the case on a linguistic scale for English as a language. So anyway, I look up why all these languages use the informal version of the pronoun with God. And if not the only answer, the most used answer that I get in various languages is, well, He's our Heavenly Father. We have a close personal relationship with Him. He wants to be our friend, or something along those lines. My intuition goes like this. Well, that's great for you, person living in the 21st century, but what about the people who were actually transcribing the Bible? Yeah, back when this distinction was coming about. Do you really think that those people were transcribing the Bible into Old French, Old English, etc., with the mindset of, oh, well, I think that I have a personal, close relationship with God, and readers of this Bible will also agree with me? No! That would be blasphemy of that time. That could warrant their death, for crying out loud. There is no way that was the case. The argument of, He's our Heavenly Father? Huh, that's a terrible argument. Yeah, right now that works, because in most countries, in most cultures, and in most languages, you don't use the formal version of you toward your parent or your parents. However, there are some people who do. In the Netherlands, for example, there are some people, even still today, who still use the formal version with their parents. There are people in Latin America who do the same in Spanish. And what I find really interesting is there are some people who will use the informal with their caring, loving, comforting mothers, and the formal with their stern, strict, traditional fathers. I think it would be very unwise, and indeed very irrational, to claim that back as early as the 11th century, when the first manuscripts of the Bible were being translated into Old English, people had a close personal relationship enough with their parents to use the informal you with them. It just didn't work that way back then. It was a different system. It works now, but not then. And so we haven't answered the question as to why in the Bibles the informal is used toward God. I did finally find a very interesting answer. The answer was, in classical Latin and biblical Greek, there was no distinction between the formal and informal you. Now, I study modern Greek, and I'm very aware that there is a distinction. However, like I said, I study modern Greek, and just like English, it very well could have been that Greek changed throughout the centuries. And indeed, when I looked up the grammar under the pronoun section of biblical Greek on multiple websites, I found the same thing. There was no distinction. Same with Latin. There was no distinction, in classical Latin at least. So, this is what we're left with. The people who transcribed the Bibles and translated them didn't change the pronouns. Probably for fear that they would get murdered, because, as I'm sure we're all aware, back in the good old days, blasphemy and doing anything that was against what the church might want could get you killed. It's not that hard to believe that they just stuck with the singular pronoun as a safety net for their own lives. So what does this mean? Well, my take on it is this. For all the translations of the Bible into languages which have the two-voice distinction yet choose to use the informal version of you with God, during a time in which that would be blasphemous to say that you have a close personal relationship with your Heavenly Father, and using the informal pronoun for such reasons, I believe that for those cases, those were mistranslations. They were errors, lost in translation. Not so much in translation, I guess, as is society and how society dealt with things back in those times. However, that doesn't mean to say that people who use the informal now are wrong. After all, nowadays it is common to see God as a friend or a father or a loving figure in your life. And in such cases, I would say, yeah, the informal would be better. I would also say that if God is just a figment of one's mind, then it is also good to use the informal, because you don't deserve the respect of using the formal with yourself. However, if God is actually the omnipotent, omniscient, or just creator, we don't even need all those omnis. If he is the creator of life, if he is truly someone to be worshipped, then I would say that it is definitely the case that you should be using the formal pronoun. And so I don't think that even today people have much of an argument for the informal. They can try, But really what they're doing is they are saying that they are on a more or less equal social level as God. Now, I'm not religious, but I think that's blasphemy. I could be wrong. Look, I really don't care much about whether or not you decide to use the informal or formal pronouns with your god or gods, but what strikes me as odd is it would seem that many of you don't either.